Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this fireside chat on data privacy and a connected world. I am Jake LaPerouk from the Project Government Oversight, and I'm going to be moderating this discussion that we have with a pair of really phenomenal panelists that I'm so excited to have here today and have the chance to chat with. First, Thomas Tam is a former Department of Justice attorney whose actions as a whistleblower in 2004 led to the public disclosure of a mass warrantless NSA surveillance system, a series of news stories that eventually were awarded the Pulitzer Prize. The revelations that he provided keyed off significant debate and changes to a program that until then had been entirely secret. Among his many accolades, he is the recipient of the Reidenhauer Truth-Telling Prize. We also have Harlow Holmes, who is the chief the Chief Information Security Officer and Director of Digital Security. In her role, she provides critical support to journalists and media organizations effectively and how they can effectively secure their communications and platforms. She is a media scholar, software programmer, activist, and is also an adjunct professor at New York University. Thank you guys so much for being here. So I want to just kind of kick off with a preliminary question for each of you that maybe you can dive a little bit into your background and expertise on this. Thomas, I'll start with you. Have there been meaningful improvements in the type of rules and structures to prompt transparency and combat secrecy and give the public an idea of the scope of government surveillance in the time since you took up your role as a whistleblower? And kind of on the contrary side to that, how much do current rules still allow surveillance to be shrouded in secrecy?
Well, it's actually a fairly complicated question, but just to refer back to my history a little bit, when I figured out that there was this warrantless wiretapping going on, one of the things that I thought I should do would be to see whether they knew what was going on the Hill. Mm-hmm. So I contacted an assistant U.S. attorney that I knew that was on the Judiciary Committee, and I went up and met with her, and I basically said, just tell me that Congress knows what's going on, and I'll go away. Quite presciently, she said, Thomas, just be careful because whistleblowers frequently don't wind up very good or very well. So I do think as a result of what you led in with and the publicity and the outrage, there were advances. I haven't studied them greatly, but there's the FISA statute was amended to include what's called 702 section, which allows data mining for non-U.S. persons who are overseas. And the catch is, there's several catches, a lot more people more expert on it than I, but you don't need probable cause to do this data mining. And there's clearly a lot of overlap with the tech companies that are primarily housed or located here in the United States. And when they're sweeping up that much information, then they're obviously going to be getting U.S. persons and U.S. citizens information. The good news is that Congress has authorized that they're aware of it. So there is more transparency, but I still think we have to stay attuned to that issue and really make sure that someone's got some oversight of it.
Great. Yeah. And I mean, as someone who has for pretty much my entire career worked on 702, I mean, it is, for all the problems that exist with that statute that we're still trying to correct, kind of wild to think of that there was, this time before then that, 702 is a much higher standard than in terms of both, the level of oversight and how surveillance is actually conducted, but also, as you're saying, like the secrecy and the fact that even other branches of government, the judiciary, Congress, that they were so kept in the dark. Harlow, could you talk a little about the fact that people can often get discouraged by the amount of data mining that occurs around them, every day when you're online, on your phone, just doing your daily activities in the world today. What would you say to people to encourage them that, privacy is, for lack of a better term, not dead, that privacy is still real? And I think maybe more importantly, what practical steps can the average person, even someone who's not tech savvy, take to protect their privacy if it's something that they do care about?
Okay, well, thank you. That's a really loaded question. And also, before I do start, I want to say congratulations, Thomas, and it's an honor to be on a panel with you. I really, really admire your work. and have for a very long while.
Thank you.
But I guess like to bring it back to what Thomas mentioned about the FISA capabilities, and especially the 702 section, definitely since, like not only since the Snowden disclosures, but since people have been, blowing the whistle and raising the alarm about these particular capabilities, a lot has changed. And what's interesting now, and why we find ourselves at a crossroads, is that 702 has normally, just covered the more standard, types of data that gets disclosed, which can mean content. It mostly means metadata. It can mean content and things like that. And it's primarily with the more traditional services that we use. So traditional telecom providers, email and things like that. But now with the advent, for a variety of reasons, with the advent of platforms like, Signal and WhatsApp and Telegram and, other platforms such as like Facebook, Twitter, and even the more obscure ones that you probably aren't using yet, but you might be using in the future, there's a whole new set of data that currently is not yet officially under the umbrella of these protections that we as the next generation of data privacy fighters have to remind people on the Hill exist out there. Because while there is a little bit of gap in between where Congress and everyone else on the Hill is in terms of understanding this data, law enforcement, on the other hand, has already jumped a little bit ahead and using a number of loopholes that exist in order to build narratives that normally would have been, gotten via, a FISA court order and stuff like that. So we can definitely go into the weeds about the mechanics of how that works on a variety of different levels. But in the meanwhile, I would just want to put in people's head the idea that, that is exactly where the next vanguard of data protection is. And still, we're yet waiting, for the Fourth Amendment is Not for Sale Act to pass. And, there's been a number of organizations that have signed off on all sorts of letters, have been appealing to members of Congress, and it's entirely bipartisan, which is huzzah in this day and age, in order to make sure that that gets through. So we still the battle has not been won, but at least the battle is being fought. I do have a number of things, that we as normal people walking about the earth can do in order to minimize our exposure to surveillance in that way. And some of them are technical, definitely do continue to use those end-to-end encrypted apps, which at least protect your communications, not so much in that it's magic and that all your conversations will magically disappear, but it definitely does shift the balance of power between people who have access to the content of your data. Also be aware that, the platforms that we use make deliberate choices about metadata. So the difference between Signal and WhatsApp is not necessarily in its protection of your content, but in the way that Meta, can access the metadata. The transactions between people as they're using these services differ greatly. And also, continue to vote, because that is the best tool that we do have. Knowing that, we have senators like Ron Wyden, who and Bernie, of course, who actually understand these details, and even reach out to technologist communities in order to get their very informed feedback about how they should translate, what the nerds know into policy that that benefits us all.
Great. Yeah, that's so great. And I think it really is valuable the way you're saying that mix of the practical aspects for your daily life, but also the collective action, whether it's supporting a bill like the Fourth Amendment Not for Sale Act or speaking to your lawmaker. I think that's phenomenal advice for everyone listening. I'd love to dive in next to a set of more broad questions to discuss. But I do want to first flag for our audience. We would love to hear your questions as well if you have them on Crowdcast. A great feature of it is there are these little prompts right at the bottom, so you can ask questions. You can vote on other folks' questions if you really see someone else has something you want to hear us talk about. So please do chime in. We want to have this, even though it's a digital discussion, be as much as a interactive chat as possible. So what I'd like to kind of just kick open, Harlow, you were actually just talking about end-to-end encryption. So tools like Signal, they're increasingly becoming really common in society. For just folks who might not be that familiar with what end-to-end encryption versus other types of encryption in general means, why is it so important to have broad access to these tools? And why do you think that it's something that is necessary when law enforcement folks often say, oh, well, it's used in this crime or that crime? I mean, just for example, we've heard recently kind of discussions of Signal making things like the January 6th investigations harder. Could you kind of just open a discussion of why those tools are so crucial for the average person, or even not necessarily the average person, but people in specific but very legitimate roles?
Mm-hmm. Well, so first and foremost, I'd start by offering a quick definition. Cliff's Notes. Signal is an example of a tool that offers end-to-end encryption, which you already did mention. And what that means is that, when you are typing, like, hey, what's up? And you press send, the person who is supposed to receive that, hey, what's up, is the only party that will be able to take that message and be able to read it. And the reason why is because, your phone, your computer, wherever you're using that particular tool, takes that message, encrypts it to a key that only you and the people that you're talking to share. And then when it goes over the wire, even if it is intercepted, which could conceivably happen, but if that does happen, then what is intercepted would actually be gibberish. And so, yeah, that is incredibly powerful. And that gives a lot of people anxiety, especially if, what you want to do to surveil a conversation that you normally have the position to intercept. So this is why a lot of people, we call these actually the crypto wars. They've been fought for decades and they'll continue. But this is why the major argument is that because this idea is so powerful and it provides so much confidentiality, not only what stops, someone who's, dealing massive amounts of drugs or, doing something incredibly horrific from using that same tool. But what we advocate is, the following. One, these tools were actually developed usually to support people whose work need to be protected by that type of confidentiality at a accessibility point and a price point that makes them efficient and usable. And so this is why, not only, so I hear, you could perhaps buy drugs using Signal, but also there are plenty of people in DC who have two phones on them. One is personal and one is for work, and work has Signal on it because that's how they're communicating with other members of their team. Other technologies, not necessarily Signal, but similar ones, were developed in order to assist human rights defenders who are going into very, very dangerous countries with high levels of surveillance that the United States government can't necessarily counteract in order to continue their missions. Diplomacy works on this. Obviously, from where I come from, journalism is done over tools like these. And so ultimately, and that's just one, reason why it's important. But second of all of these tools are, they're underlying all of these tools is literally math. It's very, very good math. and excellent advances in computing that we are able to bring to consumer grade devices. And what that means is that, as they say in DC, these encryption of this level is facts on the ground. And so it's never going to go away from a technological perspective, because the capability to provide this type of protection already exists out in the world as ideas and can be bundled into another app, another experience that's equally as usable and has equal of a reach as any of the ones that they find so threatening. So it really, really doesn't, it's somewhat of a wasted effort and a little bit embarrassing to challenge services like that in this way. And I hope that kind of answers all of the questions that you laid out there, but I have plenty more information if you ask.
Right. Thomas, I want to bring you in. You mentioned kind of human rights activists as one example. I assume whistleblowers is another pretty clear one. I would love to hear you reflect on sort of a bit of accessibility of tools like encrypted chat platforms and others. How can that assist whistleblowers? What are the type of struggles that someone in the role you took up face to get dire, importantly needed information out? And how do kind of consumer level privacy tools help that?
Well, and just to briefly go back to emphasize some of the points made by Harlow, our whole criminal justice system is predicated on a presumption of innocence, is predicated on a Fifth Amendment, that even if you're guilty, you do not have to answer the police questions. Even if you were in trial, you don't have to testify. And our whole body of common law and in case law is to protect people's rights. And we just aren't going to presume that only drug dealers are going to be using these encryption services. If I go back to my own experience, I would have welcomed encryption. Maybe there was encryption, but I wasn't aware of it. But when I reached out to various journalists and assured them that, if it came to a grand jury investigation, I would release them to say who their source was. But I think encryption and technology is really important in the future, and particularly for whistleblowers. And there haven't been a lot of whistleblowers recently, and there's still issues certainly in national security, the amount of protections. But there has been progress, just like Harlow was talking about, and progress from groups like Pogo and GAP and the good government groups have made a lot of progress in protecting whistleblowers. I remember, I would meet clandestinely with the New York Times reporters and all, and subsequently learned after the FBI raided my house that I'm sure my phone had been tapped, and I knew I had been followed, and I learned that my emails were being read. So I wasn't the greatest semi-spy, I suppose, or clandestine operative, and I basically knew I would eventually get caught.
I would wager one thing. Actually, when you say that there aren't a lot of whistleblowers, or nowadays or something like that, I do want to remind people that the only whistleblowers are not national security reporting. They come out of all sorts of industries.
Sure.
Something that I have learned in my tenure in this position is that there are different types of whistleblowers that come out of different, let's say beats, as they say in journalism. So think about sports reporting. Think about how that, some celebrity is dating some other celebrity. Think about how that real estate is being mishandled. And it really does span the gamut. But the stakes are always different. And the adversaries that these whistleblowers come up against are going to be different depending on what it is that they're covering. And actually, one of the most at-risk class, well, not the most, they're all at risk, but particularly at-risk class of whistleblowers actually are those who, talk about corporate malfeasance. We were talking about, the platforms earlier. Think about the whistleblowers that came out of Facebook just recently, and the tactics that they had to employ in order to make sure that they could communicate with the press and also protect themselves going out there. One of the things that Daniel Ellsberg, another amazing whistleblower, had mentioned to me one day, several years ago, is that there's the type of whistleblowers that we tend to kind of lionize and associate with the act of whistleblowing. So thinking of yourself, thinking of people like Ed Snowden, those are extremes. But then there's so many whistleblowers whose names we probably don't even know, who still made a huge impact. And as far as their risks go, one thing that he said was, it's really easy to think of whistleblowing as something that you can lose your life over. It's really hard for people to conceptualize that same act as something that you just lose your job over.
Jay, and I mean, those are both excellent points, and I'm glad you made them. I mean, and with regard to corporations, intellectual property protection is such a huge issue now. And I tend to get, just because I've basically been in law enforcement my entire career, I have a myopic view, I suppose. But I mean, absolutely on the corporate side, in the Facebook, we just saw people testifying before Congress on the Facebook or Meta or whatever the heck they call themselves now. So thank you very much, Professor, for bringing those points up.
Yeah, this discussion, it makes me think of how, we actually kind of very recently had a pretty prominent example of these risks of, it came to light that there was a number of efforts in the last few years to grab the phone records and other communications records of journalists, members of Congress, even their families and staff, about leak investigations from the White House. And it could be, I think, useful, given the nature of those owners, to kind of talk a little bit about kind of what is the breakdown of, Harley, you mentioned this briefly earlier, content versus metadata. And I guess, digging a little about how can that metadata aspect be so important and powerful? Especially because, when you look at different services, some of which are better than others are protecting privacy. Some will say, we don't read your emails, we don't read your texts. But, metadata can mean that that's not that sort of a promise. So could you discuss a little about kind of the importance of metadata in these fields?
Sure. So let's see, without getting too much into the weeds, although I do love to, so stop me if I do. But I did mention before that there are a number of loopholes regarding metadata that remain to be closed. And what that means is that if we do all accept that encryption is a net positive, and it's never going to go away, and without very, very special circumstances, a typical investigation is not going to get to your content, the best way to to create a case around anyone who's under suspicion is to go after the metadata. And all of the platforms definitely do have readily available portals for law enforcement or judges or whomever who's authorized to find that metadata without actually having to go for a subpoena or go for a warrant even. It's really just you can ask for it. And so the way that works is as follows. Because let's take a service that is end-to-end encrypted. I'm not going to shout out any of them by name, but a service that provides the ability for people to chat end-to-end encrypted, okay. They can't get the content, but what they can ask for is, what is the IP address of this particular user of that service. And that's a little bit of metadata, because an IP address points to where on earth you are, unless you take care to protect it. And if that's inconclusive, they can even ask for types of metadata that you wouldn't even think of. It's actually really creative. And were I wearing another hat, I would have a lot of fun doing this, like such as, let's say, if you receive push notifications, that is a bit of metadata that has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that you're using Signal or WhatsApp or whatever it is that you want to use. And sorry, my phone is ringing, but I'm ignoring it. But that said, if you can ask for, rather than the content or even metadata from Signal or WhatsApp, you can just ask for like something having to do with like how push notifications are sent. So if you're receiving, little bubbles that pop up on your phone, law enforcement can then say like, all right, like Signal, WhatsApp, that's it, you're done. We don't have any more questions, but then pivot over to who delivers those notifications, like Apple or something like that, in order to find out what credit card is associated to the Apple ID that you signed up with. And, so these are like creative uses of metadata that are definitely being explored, but not necessarily in the public imagination and not necessarily in the imagination of people on the Hill who can affect this when they're crafting legislation.
Yeah, I mean, I think for kind of the sensitive situation, I mean, Thomas, you were talking about kind of all the various steps you were taking. I mean, like what are kind of the full array of like breadcrumbs potentially left behind that someone, in a whistleblower role or talking to a journalist or some, on the flip side, someone who is a journalist, like, is going to have to be thinking about in these situations.
I'm sorry, was that to Tom or to me?
Yeah, sorry, that was to Tom.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
So I was curious, what do you think kind of, is like the full sort of set of factors you'd have to be thinking about in a situation where you're trying to serve as a whistleblower, or get in touch with a journalist, or on the flip side, that a journalist themselves would, be thinking about, in the span of not just caring about having your content monitor, but kind of this whole span of metadata collection?
Well, very interesting questions. I mean, obviously the whole digital world has changed from when I was in the Department of Justice and as an attorney before the FISA court. The tracking of using Google Maps or Apple Safari or whatever is just, is not understood by very many people. And I do think, I just think that people who believe there is something going on that is not appropriate just has to really be aware of the impact it can have on their lives, the impact that it can have on their families. I mean, I remember in my own, small case, a real sense of one of the New York Times reporters. After the story had been published, I ran into him unexpectedly in a law seminar symposium and out in the hallway, and I could tell he was just trembling for me to even just come up and talk to him and act like I knew him. Journalists to have. I just think we have to protect the press and freedom of the press and the independence of the press so much more than, even when Daniel Ellsberg was revealing the lies in Vietnam, or, when I was revealing that the government that I worked for and believed in and loved was lying to the American people. Journalists really are at very high risk. But what they do, what whistleblowers do, I believe is very important to our democracy. And you just have to know that there are going to be ramifications, significant monetarily. I lost a ton of money. If you're a lawyer, 10 years after what I had done, the DC Bar Association accused me of violating client privileged communication. And my view was that the United States was my client, not some individual governmental entity. But it's I don't want to discourage people. In fact, I think we need to encourage people, but you just have to recognize that it's not easy, and it can have an impact on your career And the one thing that I regret the most is what I put my family through. And, when my doors were almost literally broken down was really traumatic for my kids and my wife. So it's just something and I don't know what I really expected. I kind of expected maybe they would just call me up and I would talk to them, or if they had knocked on the door, I would have let them in. You just have to be really aware. And there's just so many different ways now digitally that they can monitor what you're doing and monitoring where you are.
Along those lines, I mean, I'm very curious for both of your thoughts. I mean, do you think the sort of the level of I don't even know how I might be tracked, monitored, watched, that can influence people in these roles? And if so, I mean, what are ways to kind of not just protect yourself, but make sure you're kind of, that there aren't those unknowns out there to worry about?
That's a darn good question. And probably I'm the wrong generation to discuss that. I guess I'd be calling my IT people, or my kids. My kids would probably be much more attuned to that. There's just so many different ways that law enforcement or anybody really can get information about you and your traveling and your calls and your interactions. I mean, with regard to the 702 data mining, there's what they talk about. They try to hook up concentric circles of who's contacted in the United States, and then who that person is contacting in Europe or the Middle East, and then there's a third concentric circle. And I think you have to be aware, even more aware, that there are fewer protections. And but it's good to know. I don't believe there were legal encryption services when 20 years ago, when we were talking about what I was doing. So I'm glad to hear that the good government community is definitely supporting and recognizing that legitimate businesses need to have a lot of their data encrypted.
Arlo, what do you think as far as making sure that people feel confident that they kind of know what's out there, know how they might be monitored? How can folks build up that confidence?
Mm-hmm. Well, there definitely are, the fact that there are known unknowns, that speaks to the fact that there are going to be things that will throw you for a loop when you come across them. So that said, I think if I were to be entirely, nihilistic about it, and I'm not a nihilist, I'm not at all. There are three things. One, understand, this is jargon, but there's what's called threat modeling, which is when you ask yourself, to take stock of all of your assets that matter to you, that you want to protect. You ask yourself who the adversary is, which is who you are protecting them from. And then you go through mitigations based off of that likelihood. I mean, it's a whole exercise, but ultimately it's an exercise in organization. To a person who does not feel empowered, everything is an asset, everything is an adversary, you feel powerless. However, taking the time to understand what assets are and the context under which you need to protect them can at least bring you a lot closer to protection, because you're taking all of these nebulous known unknowns and blah, 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 and kind of just properly organizing them to a point where you can make a plan. Another is compartmentalization. So there are definitely going to be certain aspects of your life that are going to get dragnetted, dragnet, I don't know, whatever that verb is. They're going to find themselves in a dragnet because that's kind of what it means to participate in the world. And no one wants to, or everyone wants to have their cake and eat it too. I have never, ever met a journalist who says I'm going to do national security reporting on this phone that I gave to my kid and the kid is playing Candy Crush. Everybody does this. And so teaching people about compartmentalization and applying discipline to that can at least mitigate a lot of these threats. The third like, yeah, once again, it's just like engaging as a citizen, which does mean voting, which does mean keeping your ear open, which does mean, yeah, like seeking out, the guidance of people whose job it is to have their ear to the ground. Yeah, because discourse is, like something that we hope doesn't die in this country, but public intellectual discourse around these issues that matter so much to us is something that we need to strive to preserve.
Great. I'd love to dive into some of our audience questions and make sure we can get your thoughts on what they have to ask. Also, please, if you're listening and have questions, we've got a couple already, but we can always add more. So if you have questions and thoughts, looks like
I'm still here. I think my video dropped off.
Oh dear. Okay. Well, glad you were still here. Hopefully we can figure the tech on that out as I just read out one of our questions. This
Sure.
is from Mickey. Says, we host a privacy workshops on our site, communitybridge.com, and find it hard to get people attending. Any ideas on how to get folks interested in protecting their privacy as well as other people's privacy? We cover different topics each week.
I would love to hear more about it. I definitely watched that stream.
I'm just curious. Do you think what are ways kind of just for the average person like that? There's a lot of very serious issues to care about and spend your time on right now. I mean, just what would kind of be your elevator pitch on why privacy is the one to care about, or I guess what is a good way that folks there could be using giving out that elevator pitch?
Well, perhaps Thomas has his own thoughts about that, but you definitely do want to just craft it in such a way so people understand that it is yet another, human right. It's your right as a citizen. Traditionally, our country has worked so hard, to protect these rights, and this is just an extension of centuries of work towards this, however, albeit imperfect, but still lofty work in progress. Yeah, there are different cultural attitudes about it. And also I say, usually when people say oh, I don't care about privacy because I don't feel like I have anything to hide. The one thing that I do love to counter with is that it's never up to you to determine the context under which your anything, no matter how seemingly innocent and innocuous, is going to be perceived when it's in the hands of someone else. Because when data is in the hands of someone else who you did not give that data to, then they are an adversary. And an adversary's only goal is to make you look bad. So.
And I, not only would I comment that, one issue with regard to privacy is nothing to hide. I think a lot of people, maybe older people, just feel like, well, Big Brother definitely is watching, and Big Brother already knows, and all these big tech companies. And so, what is the point of even having an expectation of privacy? You feel like you can't fight the big tech companies. But I mean, I think what Harlow started off very early on in the discussion was about voting and keeping our elected officials' feet to the fire. I'd be interested in hearing about the Fourth Amendment is not for sale issue. I was unaware of that. I hope to become back involved
It's really interesting.
I bet it sounds absolutely, and I would like to get involved with that kind of work. I'm getting close to retiring. My criminal or my clients have been charged with crimes. Some of them want me to retire sooner rather than later. But I really do think that, we have to be citizens of the world, really, in terms of, and we have to understand how everything is interconnected. And the person who posed the question, keep at it, keep pushing the rock up the hill. to try and educate people and tell people what is going on. I mean, we always venerate our founding fathers. There weren't a lot of founding mothers, but we have founding fathers, and we've since learned that they had a lot of personal flaws. It probably is a flaw that we don't have a specific right to privacy in the amendments, and the Bill of Rights, with regard to issues like a woman's right to choose. The penumbra of our rights led to privacy, but I think it'd be useful to just really say that United States citizens actually have a right to privacy.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, I think it's great to be thinking about kind of those ways, whether it's legislation or others, that kind of despite that kind of onset of, oh, there's so much out there, that you really do still have a lot of control over this stuff. And yeah, as an organization that supports the Fourth Amendment's Not for Sale Act, I will definitely add one to that pitch. And yeah, always happy to talk about that and encourage everyone to look at that bill, read about it, and hopefully, if you think it's a good measure like we do, call your member of Congress and tell them to bring it to the floor, because it's a really important piece of legislation. I'd like to pull another. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, one thing that I find interesting, not to get like too much into the weeds about the Fourth Amendment's Not for Sale bill, is that it reimagines like what it means for platforms to be part of or to be under the third party doctrine, whereas like they're positing that like literally like because it's on a platform or whatever, then it's under the third party doctrine, and thus like we can do with that data whatever we want, no expectation of privacy. But it's interesting because it's ultimately like an argument where you're that is in tension with like just like our very existence with computers, with data. And so like it actually is like bringing this argument to like what I think might be its like logical conclusion and hopefully its end. So that's one to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I think, I mean, that's another very important, the Supreme Court is, I think, not as popular as it used to be. One thing I think they've done very well is start to encounter the fact that the concept of the third party doctrine just does not work when most of your data is housed in a computer in some warehouse and by a company somewhere hundreds of miles away.
Checkmate.
Nobody understands the cloud.
So I'd love to take another audience question. We have one from Sean. He asks, what are the best ways to build enforcement teeth into the efforts to protect privacy? This actually just follows up very well from our discussion. Right now, it feels like when a government agency or company gets caught misusing private data, there's a short period of public shaming. Then they simply apologize, say they'll do better. How can we effectively punish such behavior and create adequate disincentives and consequences?
I would say that it's in your question, you said corporation or government agency, and you would definitely, or we would all, benefit from appreciating the differences between those two and the different, carrots and sticks, that you can apply there. I can't really speak so much to government agencies other than the platitudes that I've spouted about voting, but it is important to vote. But as far as corporations are concerned, those are easier places to apply pressure, either with voting with your dollar, meaning disengaging from the surveillance capitalism that they enforce upon you, such as now that Facebook is Meta, their user engagement is on the decline, and other platforms are also noticing the same, and forcing them into positions where they're having to scramble in order to keep your engagement if you want to continue to engage. That's actually a lot more effective. There's also the interplay between those things. So another thing that's interesting about the Fourth Amendment is not for sale bill is because it is pretty much like the product of like what happened with another, like a corporation, another tool, a private company, Clearview AI, which was like just scraping everything that had your face on it and selling it to law enforcement. And the public outcry around that actually worked its way into legislation. So, like these are things that we can do. Yeah, but essentially vote with your dollars. Understand that surveillance or like your engagement is literally the new currency. It's like the next gold standard. And so if you can find ways to refuse to participate in that capitalist system, then you do have a way of affecting it, especially if we all do it en masse.
And the only thing I would add from a governmental standpoint is I think we have to continue to strengthen Inspector General's offices in the various agencies and make sure that they are given a modicum of independence. They're frequently our best hope in with regard to governmental agencies. And with regard to corporations, I suppose you occasionally hear about stockholders, bringing to bear their interest in human rights and privacy rights.
So one question I'm curious to get both of your thoughts on, a lot of the time threats to privacy come from new technology or sort of new applications of technology. And that's true, from kind of an array of tools that influence regular, folks every day, or, from the like very high tech type of national security surveillance, Thomas, that you focused on. Is there any type of technology or sort of, not necessarily even a new technology, but kind of a new application or new sort of focus of surveillance that you see as, especially concerning that folks should, know about?
Who are we? The question is for both of us?
Yes.
I think I'll defer to Arlo and hear a really educated answer.
Gosh, let's see. I mean, they're not new technologies at all, but you definitely do want to think about the Internet of Things stuff. So when we're talking about the interplay between surveillance technology and the law, this is like exemplified in products like Amazon's Ring cameras, which there was a huge public outcry about, being designed first, when it first came out, being designed in such a way that it like law enforcement could grab your Ring camera feed in order to participate, or in order to bring you as an unwilling participant into an investigation without your consent, via the device that they had a like front door channel to Amazon in order to get data from. The public outcry around that caused two things. One, now better security controls on those devices themselves, so that type of access is not abused, and also better communication and being able to opt in to participating in such a way rather than opting in by default. So now and so it's just like a switch of preferences. But that said, that's only one example. That's the anecdote we know very well because you read it in Motherboard, but there's so much out there, especially in Internet of Things land, that might contribute to these types of surveillances that we aren't necessarily aware of. So I'm looking at all of our light bulbs. I'm looking at all of our water meters, and just thinking about those particular possibilities there. So that's one example.
So we're approaching the hour. I could talk about whether it's the Fourth Amendment's Not for Sale Act or just kind of ways that kind of the simple apps that you can upload to your phone that can make you secure in your data and daily life. But I know a lot of the time when I have these discussions, they can be a little ominous. I have the little "this is fine" dog behind me because usually when it's issues of privacy and civil liberties and civil rights, it feels like everything's on fire. So I like to try to cap these types of discussions off on a positive note to take folks out with. So I would love to hear each of you. What is something, whether it's just a new tool, we've already talked a good bit about kind of laws and actions you can take, but a legislative avenue or sort of, way that you can kind of use your vote, or just kind of a trend we're seeing in society that you feel very positive and optimistic about? What is one thing in this space that you just, is making you feel encouraged right now?
Well, I would like to hear about the Fourth Amendment for sale is not for sale act. I still have some faith in the courts, and certainly the lower courts and the appellate courts in protecting our rights. And I remember when I was working with in the FISA court with regard to the technology. Things that were said in public about after it became public about the warrantless wiretapping, and they would always give a ticking bomb scenario. What do we do? Is that we had the ability to react to those, and we have technological advances, and I'm sure they've grown exponentially, that the government is able to use for correct purposes. The danger is in them using them for incorrect purposes or unlawful purposes. But I'm basically optimistic, and then go back to like good government organizations and voting and just staying connected in a connected world gives me some hope for the future.
For me, I'm actually really optimistic about the opportunities that, if there's any silver lining to the past, like going on 3 years that we've all spent in abject horror, the internet has changed in a couple of really interesting ways. There's been a little bit of like isolation and siloing of the way that different jurisdictions treat the internet and treat transactions around it, that are now like in a really, really like opportunistic time to explore and to learn from. And also just our relationship to tools in ways that we didn't necessarily think of as essential or took for granted actually has like a lot of promise. I spend a lot of my time either doing trainings or security audits or, I don't know, like a variety of like, discussing with people about how best to use the tools that they have in front of them. And it's been somewhat like, I hope this doesn't make me sound weird, but like somewhat invigorating to consider these new challenges based off of the fact that you have to reorganize a whistleblowing investigation when everybody's on the Zoom, or talking to people about digital safety when everybody's working from home and once again your kids are playing Wordle all day or something. But these are like such unique challenges, and I can't wait to see where it goes.
Right. Yeah, those are both, I think, very thoughtful notes for us. I really want to get in kind of, I am excited about kind of legislative spaces, both items Congress is considering right now, like the Fourth Amendment's Not for Sale Act, to give it its, I think, pejorative plug here, but also kind of some items we have in the future, like 702, which we discussed earlier. One good feature about that law that Congress put in is that they have to reauthorize it every few years or it just disappears. And next year we are set for Congress to need to take that up again. So, that's another area where they're going to have to do a debate on it. So we're going to get a good discussion and debate and hopefully some reforms on that big kind of warrantless national security program that, Thomas, your work kind of got the ball rolling on, and hopefully that we continue to try to strive in a more positive direction for. I would be happy to take this chat all day, but I want to be respectful of your time, guys. But thank you so much. This has been a really great discussion, and I'm really glad we got to have it and got to share with everyone here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for asking me.
Congratulations on your prize.
Thank you, and thanks for asking me. And I guess I'll have to check out Wordle.
Definitely recommend Wordle.
Very good. All right. Thanks.
Bye.
Say hi to everybody, Jake. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.